Good evening. I'm Dorothy Austin, Director of the Erickson Center. On behalf of the Erickson Center and the Kennedy School Forum, I wish to welcome you to the second and concluding lecture of the 1985 Erickson Lectures, which this year are being given by Sissela Bach, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Brandeis University. The title of Professor Bach's lectures is Human Values and the Threat of War. In her first lecture, Mrs. Bach addressed the topic, Is any moral perspective adequate to the present crisis? This evening's lecture is titled Opportunities for Response. These lectures are a principal part of this year's educational program at the Erickson Center, in which faculty and students alike from various disciplines, including philosophy, religion, literature, psychology, psychiatry, and visual arts, are having an opportunity to come together in seminars and in special events, such as this one, to address that species-wide crisis which faces us today. We look to Sissela Bach as a leading philosopher to provide us with a wider perspective that might, if I may quote Shelley and Mrs. Bach, that might equip us to imagine intensely and comprehensively. This evening, you will have an opportunity once again to greet Sissela Bach as well as Joan and Eric Erickson at the conclusion of the lecture at a reception upstairs in the penthouse, to which, once again, you are all invited. I should add that following her talk, Professor Bach has indicated that she will be happy to receive questions from the audience. And now it is an honor and indeed always a challenge to hear from Sissela Bach.
Thank you very much. A friend told me after the last lecture that in case I had raised any expectations, perhaps I should take a cue from the present administration in Washington and try to lower expectations as they are trying to do before the summit. So I can't very well do that, since I think there are some expectations to be raised, but I do hope that you will do everything you can to challenge what I say and to suggest other opportunities, perhaps. There are many that I won't be able to cover in this one evening. I want to begin again with something that Simone Weil wrote of the Trojan War. She said that to be outside a situation as violent as this is to find it inconceivable. To be inside it is to be unable to conceive its end. Thinking about the Cold War is like that, I suggest. When we step outside it in our imagination, we find it inconceivable that any set of nations should have come to endanger the entire world by relying on the threat of such intolerable violence in mutual self-defense. And yet, from our insider's perspective of the species-wide crisis resulting from the threat of such violence, we are unable to conceive its end, unable to conceive an end to the crisis, that is, unless it be a catastrophic one, bringing what Kant called the perpetual peace on the vast graveyard of the human race. It is this despairing incapacity to conceive any but an unthinkable end to the present crisis that I want to address tonight. What practical steps can we take to lessen the threat? How can governments begin to shift toward more serious collaborative efforts in this direction? What opportunities are there for public officials to assist in this shift? And is there any room at all for private citizens to make more than symbolic gestures? I want to argue that there are such opportunities and that they are open to us all. This does not at all mean that enough people will seize them, or that if they do, they will necessarily succeed in turning the corner of this crisis. I am convinced, however, that if we do nothing, we shall surely fail. In my last lecture, I suggested that if we are ever to see our crisis for what it is and sort out which policies render it more severe, we must stretch our perspective so that it becomes global rather than parochial, and we must endow it with sufficient imagination to perceive fully what is at stake for all human beings, whether they are compatriots or not, adversaries or not. I suggested further that rather than aiming for some utopian goal of harmony between nations, we should single out a limited set of fundamental moral constraints and do our best to implement them. The fundamental constraints that I set forth concern violence, deception, and betrayal. These are forms of conduct which deny value to human beings, debilitate agents as well as victims, and damage the trust needed for cooperation. In addition, I argued that a constraint on government secrecy is needed in order to avoid the concealment of such conduct. Official secrecy is sometimes necessary, in diplomatic negotiations, for example, or in maintaining personnel records, but unless it is severely restricted, it invites to and covers up every form of wrongdoing. In the light of this perspective, the opportunities for change go far beyond arms control alone. It is surely of the greatest importance to control armaments and to reduce the risks of war, but by themselves such efforts are likely to fail so long as the larger political context remains one of such distrust that genuine collaboration between nations, even for the sake of survival, is out of the question. Distrust between superpowers is now at one of its highest points ever. The risks of war are correspondingly higher. Everyone points out that nuclear war would be unlike anything we have ever known. But what they do not always add is that it might well begin after a process of the same deteriorating relationships that have preceded wars in the past and that we are experiencing right now. True, nuclear war could also begin through an accident or some kind of miscalculation. But even these are more likely to take place and to escalate into all-out war under conditions of strong international pressure or when domestic opinion reaches the boiling point. And even apart from such errors, war is more likely to begin, as it has so often in the past, after communications have broken down or become frayed, after leaders have grown used to resorting to increasingly apocalyptic name-calling, after an armaments race has impoverished nations, after lies and rumors have begun to circulate more and more wildly, after governments have become used to breaking international law whenever it suits them. If those are the factors that contribute to the danger of war, then they must receive much more careful examination than they have in the past. It will doubtless be difficult to reduce them, for the distrust in which they are rooted is in one sense entirely appropriate. After all, what could be a more reasonable attitude for governments facing weapons of such vast destruction and aware of the ceaseless policies of economic, psychological, and diplomatic hostility aimed at their nations? But however reasonable and appropriate such bottomless distrust may be at any one time, no country, and certainly no world community, can afford it in the long run. It erodes ordinary moral constraints and short-circuits careful deliberation. It encourages every hostile practice short of all-out war, and it interferes so relentlessly with efforts to reduce the military threat to mankind that it becomes a major factor in increasing the likelihood of nuclear war. As a result, we have no choice but to engage in every effort to cut back on that underlying distrust, as well as to the military threat itself, to reverse somehow the tight spiral of ever-increasing distrust and preparations for war. In the military arena, efforts to reduce distrust are underway through so-called confidence-building measures, proposals for improved hotline and crisis communication, and moves to reduce the likelihood of accidental war. There are many avenues for improvement in this respect, and all are worth pursuing and supporting. And yet these efforts cannot suffice. They are, as we know, dwarfed by the arms race itself and by a worsening of the international climate. So if we are serious about combating the distrust that spurs the arms race, we cannot look to the military arena alone. We must overcome the policies of partisanship and hostility which nourish distrust and undermine every effort of serious negotiations. We must look closely at such practices as deceptive propaganda and cheating on international treaties, at economic warfare and subversion. It is these ancient policies which have so often in the past been thought indispensable to national security that now threaten collective survival. The constraints that I have mentioned on violence, deceit, and betrayal, and on secrecy when it conceals and encourages these, are needed to restrain actions in government as in private life that go against the fundamental preconditions for adequate moral response, respect for persons, and concern for the difficulties with which they labor. And for the first time in history, these constraints are now also needed if we are to reduce existing distrust between nations enough to avert the present threat to the survival of mankind. Tonight I want to consider the practical opportunities for change in the light of the perspective I have suggested. Of course, no one imagines that violence, deceit, and breaches of faith can be banished from the world. But is it possible for nations to resort to them less assiduously? Give them up where they are clearly counterproductive. See just how counterproductive they are. I shall begin with a view on practical government affairs that is far from uncommon. A New York Times reporter recently interviewed General Mohammed Zia, the president of Pakistan, in connection with his visit to the United Nations. According to the interviewer, General Zia proposed steps to avoid a nuclear arms race between Pakistan and India, and denied that his country was developing a nuclear bomb or planning a nuclear test with Chinese help. He also denied that Pakistan had training camps for Sikh terrorists, as India has charged, and reportedly added, "You just don't soil your hands unnecessarily unless you can achieve." You just don't soil your hands unnecessarily unless you can achieve. The words have a special ring in the mouth of a man who has banned political parties in his nation after ousting and then executing its prime minister. But the view that it may be worthwhile to dirty one's hands in the interest of important goals can also be heard in a great many government circles in democracies, and indeed even in schools of government. To be sure, officials in democracies would recoil at toppling domestic government leaders by military means, but not all show the same restraint abroad. Indeed, modern governments carry out a great many policies abroad that would not pass muster if carried out at home. Dirty hands calculations seem to come more easily when the victims are foreign. By now we have all had to learn a new vocabulary in international relations for activities that result from such calculations. We hear of psychological warfare, of counterinsurgency, of covert action, of disinformation and destabilization. They are ancient policies of aggression and deceit in modern garb that governments now pursue on a global scale and with the aid of the most up-to-date technology. And just as there seems to be no end to the Cold War, so there seems to be none to these policies, even on the part of democratic governments that would ordinarily find it hard to give them open support. It seems to have become part of national policy to injure one's opponents as much as one can, even in peacetime. These days, I believe it would be regarded as downright subversive in many capitals of the world to argue, as Montesquieu did in his Spirit of Laws of 1748, that international law was based on the principle that nations ought to do the most good to one another in peacetime and in wartime the least harm possible. The common reference to soiling one's hands in underhand adventures reflects a long-standing tradition in political thinking. It takes government affairs to be so inherently amoral, sometimes corrupt, that public officials, no matter how principled, must expect to get their hands dirty if they want to get anything done, if they want, in the words attributed to General Zia, to achieve. The mark of their integrity is that they experience some compunction. The mark of their realism is that they overcome it when their goals so require. In Jean-Paul Sartre's play, Dirty Hands, the central character, Herderer, defends his recourse to violence and deceit during the French resistance in World War II. Hardened by years of partisan struggle, he calls his dirty hands dirty right up to the elbows, having plunged them in filth and blood, and derides the notion of being able to govern innocently. At the end of the First World War, Max Weber expressed the anguish of this position most forcefully in a paper entitled Politics as Vocation. Politics, he argued, operates with special means, power backed up by violence. Its tasks can only be solved by violence, he said. Deceit and breaches of faith are part of the game as well. They must be used with good judgment and a sense of responsibility. But those who refuse all such methods invite failure and defeat, perhaps at the hand of even more unscrupulous leaders. Weber ended by setting up a dichotomy for all ethically oriented conduct. One has to choose, he said, between two fundamentally differing and irreconcilably opposed maxims. Conduct can be oriented to the absolutist ethic of the Sermon on the Mount, that he called the ethic of absolute ends, asking us to be saintly in everything. Or it can be guided by an ethic of responsibility, in which one has to weigh the foreseeable consequences of one's actions. Adherence to the ethic of ultimate ends may damage and discredit their goals through their very refusal to compromise about morality, Weber held, since they dismiss any responsibility for consequences, no matter how disastrous, so long as they do what they think is right. Advocates of the ethic of responsibility are more likely to achieve their goals, but since they have to be willing to use morally dubious methods to do so, they let themselves in for what Weber called the diabolical forces lurking in all violence. Weber's article is still required reading in courses on government today. It is a powerful effort to dispel simplistic post-war optimism. But his bitter assumption that all who engage in politics must open themselves up to the diabolic forces lurking in violence is rarely questioned. And the dichotomy that he sets up between the ethic of ultimate ends, absolute ends, and that of responsibility is itself far too simplistic. It is a matter of all or nothing, he says, offering no argument for such an improbable state of affairs except a reference to the Sermon on the Mount. Readers who ponder his two stark alternatives are often driven to opt for the ethic of responsibility with all the moral compromises that Weber claims it requires. In so doing, they immediately leave to one side a large part of the subtle process of moral deliberation about particular cases that politics at its best requires. If they notice a murky hint from Weber at the end of his article, they are likely to be even more confused. Weber there indicates that the most admirable politicians somehow unite the two ethics that he had earlier called irreconcilable. But since he offers no hint of how this reconciliation is to be brought about, readers can do little except hope to achieve it by sheer luck. In 1973, Michael Walzer published an article on the problem of dirty hands in political action that continued the ancient debate that Max Weber set forth so eloquently over half a century earlier. To Sartre's question about whether one can govern innocently, Walzer's answer was no. He could not govern innocently and didn't think it possible for anyone else either. While it is sometimes right for someone in government to go against moral constraints, such as those on lying and on torture, for the good of his fellow citizens, that person will have done wrong and is no longer innocent, according to Walzer. Like Weber, Walzer spoke of the need for politicians to do what they know is wrong if they want to succeed in politics, and of the anguish of the best among them in knowing that they have done so. He writes of an elected official who tortures a rebel leader in order to learn where bombs are hidden that are set to explode all around the capital city within hours. Now he is a guilty man, writes Walzer. His willingness to acknowledge and bear, and perhaps to repent and do penance for his guilt, is evidence and it is the only evidence he can offer us, both that he is not too good for politics and that he is good enough. Here is the moral politician. It is by his dirty hands that we know him. In the last decade, articles and debates on dirty hands have multiplied, and something that would surely trouble both Weber and Walzer has happened in the process. In government, as in police and military circles, the expression dirty hands has become a code word. For many, it is now part of a rather quick cost-benefit calculation. One totes up the advantages one hopes to achieve by taking a particular action or endorsing an entire policy, such as that of toppling a government. Then one weighs these benefits against the doubts, including the possibility of dirty hands among the costs. Gone is the personal anguish of which Weber and Walzer had spoken. The quick calculation is often all that remains. It has become yet another form of stunted moral reasoning used to bypass genuine consideration of what is at issue in a morally questionable government policy or action. Part of the reason stems from yet another form of oversimplification. Too often the study of excruciating choices between two evils leads public officials to conclude that the need for moral compromise is present even in the most commonplace choices. Too often, the requirements of desperate measures at a time of direct danger to national security leads them to conclude that the same measures are acceptable even when no danger exists. Yet this is surely too quick a leap of reasoning. It is true that acute crises, such as hypothetical situations of terrorist nuclear blackmail, may leave few opportunities to respect moral constraints, but daily political choices are rarely of that excruciating nature. The danger in focusing exclusively on the hardest choices is that all moral conflicts will appear so difficult and so daunting that they had best be left aside, and that biased perception and stunted deliberation will take the place of careful reasoning about problems. When that happens, more and more unexamined excuses find easy acceptance. Officials may then argue, without further elaboration, that they were only following orders, or that they were merely reciprocating actions by the other side, or that national security requires them to sacrifice their principles. To be sure, such arguments are sometimes weighty, but because they have such standard form and are brought out so automatically, they too tend to bypass moral deliberation. And once the excuse has become accepted, no further reflection seems called for, even if the initial action turns into a long-term policy. Those who took part in the original choice are then so thoroughly implicated that it is even more difficult for them to reconsider. And those who are confronted for the first time with existing policy of a morally questionable kind can fall back on yet another standard excuse, that it is not up to them to try to re-examine long-standing national policy. But it is up to them, and it is up to us to take a very close look at all those policies that have somehow gained the status of permanence. Perhaps some of them were once needed as a response to some acute crisis, but no one can claim that they are all now needed. Together, they damage national security, they delay the settlement of regional conflicts, and they hinder collective efforts for security through permanent peace. We need to ask questions, therefore, about all the hostile policies that are part of the Cold War. Few tasks could be as important to future public servants as examining what goes into abdicating moral judgment, examining the arguments why strong moral constraints that one ordinarily honors are not applicable in a particular situation. In intelligence activities, as in psychological warfare, in diplomacy, as in the subsidizing of foreign resistance groups, it is possible to single out practices that by their very nature raise sharper moral issues than others. Consider 3 instances of unlawful and inhumane assaults upon foreigners carried out in the name of national security, directly or indirectly related to the Cold War. the French sabotage of the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior, the Soviet shooting down of the South Korean airliner KAL-007, and the United States' secret bombardment of Cambodia during the Vietnamese War. Whatever benefit the responsible government agencies may have counted on from these actions were far outweighed, even from a purely national point of view, by the damage to their nation's reputation. But in addition, we have to think of the harm done to those whose planning made such violence possible, to those who carry it out, to those who cover up and lie about the actions as long as possible. For some, there may have been anguish. For others, a routine appeal to the exigencies of national security may have sufficed to still any doubts. These actions were sufficiently egregious once discovered and received so much criticism, both domestic and worldwide, that they are not likely to recur again in exactly that form. But the attitudes which made them possible have not disappeared. They make possible the collusion with terrorists and with oppressive governments, the acceptance of destabilization as national policy against governments regarded as objectionable, and the peacetime mining of international shipping lanes. The disrespect for law to which such practices contribute remains long after they cease, and the distrust that they generate cannot easily be dispelled. Consider next the common practice of aggressive denunciations of other nations as satanic, or an empire of evil, or of its leaders as imperialist warmongers. In recent years, the intensity and violence of invective between government leaders in many nations have reached a new level of contemptuousness. If such language is taken seriously, it cannot help angering its intended targets and increasing distrust in the speaker's proclaimed desire for accommodation. If it is taken to be mere rhetoric for domestic consumption, it raises doubts about the speaker's sincerity, once again giving added cause for distrust. Take next the practices which undermine, in perhaps the most direct way, the trust needed for arms control negotiations to succeed. The covert cheating on arms agreements, the failures to respond to inquiries about apparent cheating, or efforts to reinterpret the language of existing treaties so as to breach them. If we look at these and similar practices, it is clear that some are more damaging than others, and some more legitimate than others. If a nation's diplomatic efforts to protest an adversary's genuine breach of an arms agreement have failed, for instance, it is important to bring this breach to public notice. If it is possible for a nation or a group of nations to topple a ruler such as Idi Amin by cutting off all computer sales to him and all purchases of coffee, many would regard it as right to do so. In neither case is direct violence or deceit or breach of faith involved. Just as we can single out legitimate cases of severe accusation and destabilization and other practices and show how they differ from practices that are clearly illegitimate, such as the ones I mentioned at first, so it is possible to consider with greater care the marginal cases where it is hard to be certain. Two arguments are important in this respect. The first holds that the various practices, however morally objectionable in their own right, are made more legitimate by the fact that the adversary is carrying them out as well, perhaps to an even greater extent. A government that engages in cheating and lying can hardly complain, it is argued, about being repaid in the same coin. This argument is surely correct within its own narrow frame of reference. The trouble is, one still has to ask what repaying in the same coin does to oneself, to innocent bystanders, to the likelihood of still others imitating the action, and above all to general trust, and thus in the long run to the chances for reducing the danger of a larger war. As a result, the burden of proof remains heavy on those who advocate stooping to every shady practice employed by adversaries. The second argument is more weighty, that such methods are at times the only way to protect national security. In wartime, as in direct peacetime threats to a nation, the recourse to violence as to deception, and even the breach of treaty obligations, may indeed be required in sheer self-defense. The trouble here lies in the different interpretations of what exactly national security requires. Just about all the practices I have mentioned, including the most egregious instances, have been justified in some quarters as necessary for national security. There is no reason to leave matters so vague. These practices lend themselves to systematic thinking and moral reflection. Even if you don't agree with me that most of the practices I've discussed do more harm than good to a nation, you may agree that some fall in that category. And in that case, you will agree also that there are opportunities for change. As it is, the blanket references to national security or to dirty hands, even in the most egregious cases, convince nobody. And the cumulative damage to both domestic and to international trust is immense. Public trust in governments suffers, first of all, from underhanded activities at home and abroad. To the extent that excuses proliferate and falsehoods come to light, people come to expect manipulation even when there is none. In this way, honest politicians and government officials find their words and actions doubted through no fault of their own. It is hard now for many people to trust anyone in politics, even the most scrupulous. Statistics show a great decline in respect for public officials over the last decades. Voting participation has declined correspondingly. Among young people, fewer than 50% vote. And since I mentioned last time something that my mother had said, I thought that I would be excused if I quoted my father at this point. He always used to say in studying the United States that this country had the peculiarity that on any issue there would always be a 20% lunatic fringe. Well, in that case, if you take the fact that so few people vote, perhaps around 40-50% sometimes, and that 20% of the ones who do vote may very well be in the lunatic fringe because they are very desirous of having an impact, you can see that there is rather little room for maneuver for all the others. So that the combination of suspicion and apathy toward government practices on the part of a large proportion of the public reduces government accountability and makes it easier, not harder, to expand the various questionable policies. Suspicion and apathy also make people more vulnerable. The less they are able to place trust in public officials, the less they will trust information of any kind. They become instead open to simplistic answers like the many conspiracy theories that lead such a charmed life in our societies, in part because so many people are utterly distrustful and ill-informed. Secondly, the cumulative damage to international trust from the various practices involving violence, deceit, and breaches of faith is enormous. The minimal trust needed for negotiations is difficult enough to maintain without the erosion from these activities, often undertaken by officials quite independent of those who do the negotiating. Even a momentary stretching of perspectives from the narrow one concerned only with short-term partisan advantage to that concerned with long-term needs of the community of nations would display the needless damage done by such activities as disinformation and false accusations. So it is necessary and urgent to study the different practices, to debate them, to spell out the many subtle ways in which long-term and cumulative harm to trust is done by policies undertaken for short-term and questionable benefits. We need to challenge and to combat those policies that harm the cause of peace and to support the opponents of such policies in Congress and in the nation at large as well as abroad. But in order for such efforts to succeed, still another thing is necessary. It's important that the flow of information about government activities should remain as open as possible. For this reason, we must also use every opportunity to combat the growing pressures for government secrecy which threaten to silence informed criticism. The pressures for secrecy are strong in this country, in spite of its traditions of free speech and a free press, and never stronger than when international tensions are high. The present administration, confronting in the Soviet Union a government that exercises pervasive secrecy and censorship, has moved to reciprocate on many fronts. It is as if the government were trying to catch up in the secrecy race as strenuously as it pursues the arms race. It has acted, for instance, to increase press censorship at times of military activities such as the invasion of Grenada. It has moved to enlarge the exemptions of the Freedom of Information Act, to slow the information it does provide, and to expand the powers to classify information as secret, as well as through stricter limits on travel, research, publication, and commerce. But perhaps the most dramatic and far-reaching of the new efforts to control information was to be found in the National Security Presidential Directive of March 11, 1983. It would have required over 100,000 federal employees with access to highly classified information to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a lifetime pledge to submit for pre-publication review, that means censorship, any writings that contained or described, quote, activities that produce or relate to, unquote, such classified information. The category of what relates to such information was left vague. It would certainly have required advance clearance for many writings about military policy and covert activities by former officials in, say, Vietnam, Iran, or Central America, even if the information conveyed was not itself classified and was already public knowledge. Confronted with the prospect of such muzzling, many former and present government officials spoke up. They were joined by congressional committees and by many private citizens. The opposition grew so strong that the administration decided a year later to suspend plans for such a measure. To be sure, suspension is not repeal. The measure may return in some slightly different guise, and there are many other ways of cutting back on criticism. But as for now, public protest and hard work on the part of a great many individuals has succeeded in averting a threat to free speech of unparalleled proportions for this nation, a threat that would, in addition to all its other effects, have made it possible for most of the practices that I discuss tonight to receive even less debate and challenge than they now do. I have wanted to show by means of these examples that an extended and deepened perspective on the present crisis calls for more than attention to the arms impasse in its own right, though that is surely of prime importance. We must also challenge the many hostile practices between nations that involve violence, deceit, and breaches of faith to various degrees, for they allow distrust to undercut cooperation for collective survival. And it is not even enough to work to overcome the arms impasse and these practices without combating also the official secrecy, here and abroad, that conceals and distorts information about them both. This clearly makes our task more complicated, but it also presents more opportunities for having an impact. This is why I am so certain that it is premature to give up. I know I speak to many in this audience who have worked long and hard for peace and who have known times of discouragement. And I know that others here, young and old, see little hope in undertaking such work in the first place. But I think we have to stop and think. Just as government officials can slip into biased perception and stunted forms of reasoning too easily, so I believe that it is too easy for all of us, private citizens, to lapse into a sense of hopelessness and apathy about working to increase the chances for peace. It is tempting to give in to the notion that one should somehow either be directly instrumental in preventing nuclear war or else conclude that all is lost and give up trying. But why should we think in this odd way about the risk of war when we are perfectly willing to put in our piecemeal and often indirect efforts to reduce other immense problems, such as those of poverty or disease? There is nothing inevitable about the present levels of distrust and fear, nothing mechanical, nothing irreversible. Such tensions are built up in 1,000 ways by decisions and failures to decide on the part of a great many individuals. They can be reversed in the same way, but it will require action on many problems that are usually allowed to drift, and this in turn will require a conscious stretching of perspectives on the part of public officials as of private citizens. Where can we look for models of how such a perspective has guided action? Where can we see examples of people who did bring about change of the kind we need now? I would like to make a somewhat unorthodox proposal in this respect, that schools of government and other educational institutions return to what was once thought central to a complete education, the widespread study of exceptional human lives. We read in the autobiographical works by Montaigne and John Stuart Mill and Margaret Mead and so many others about the central role that this study of lives played in their own development. In reading about the lives of Socrates or of Cato the Elder, of Confucius or Saint Teresa of Avila, of Saint Francis or Joan of Arc, they found models of principled response to moral difficulties, a clearer and fuller way of perceiving and deliberating about them, greater integrity and courage in choice, greater strength in execution. In our century, it is people such as Albert Schweitzer, Simone Weil, Martin Luther King, and Mahatma Gandhi whose lives offer the clearest models of a creative, often transforming, response to the danger that concerns us most directly, the threat of violence and of war. When government officials and private individuals ask how they might collaborate to overcome the narrow perspective and the stunted forms of deliberation that aggravate this danger, they could do worse than reflect on the example set by such individuals. And in so doing, they can draw on resources not available to earlier generations. In addition to returning to the classical sources, such as Plutarch's Lives, they can benefit from the illuminating work by Joan and Erik Erikson and from scholarship in many disciplines with respect to individual lives, such as Gandhi's. To speak of certain lives, such as those of Gandhi, that of Gandhi, as exemplary, does not mean that they are perfect in some moral sense. On the contrary, these individuals know and speak of their faults, and their many detractors point out still other shortcomings. Nor does it mean that we should accept every aspect of their activities or beliefs as exemplary. Rather, we can learn from their lives, share the sheer spaciousness of their perspectives, deliberate with them, examine the choices they made and the ways in which they try to live up to their commitments. It is how they choose to live and the ideals that they express through living that astonishes and inspires. Above all, it is their consistency and their sense of direction building up over an entire life. In a word, it is their character. Gandhi was born in 1869, just 5 years after the birth of Max Weber. But in 1918, as Max Weber was coming to the end of his life and setting forth his bitter view of politics as rooted in violence, Gandhi was gathering strength for political action of a different kind. Where Weber had assumed that nonviolence had to be passive and ineffective in the face of the world's realities, Gandhi meant to show that it could gain the momentum to overcome violence and injustice. And where Weber took for granted that politics was inherently corrupting, Gandhi insisted on working out methods in both personal and group life to guard against just that corruption. Nonviolence is surely not a new value. It is central to most religions and most moral philosophies of any depth. But it has received an entirely new practical elaboration in this century. In this process, those who work to make it more effective have had to take into account today's methods of government control. They have had to explore the limits of nonviolent resistance and consider possible situations in which it is of no avail. And they have had to consider the potential for misuse that such resistance also carries, much like all other exercises of power. Gandhi initiated a great deal of this practical and theoretical elaboration. He saw non-violent resistance as a means of bringing the moral constraint on violence to the forefront, even among those opposed to his efforts. But he was clear about the greater likelihood of both failure and moral deterioration for persons who lack other constraints as they exercise non-violent resistance to injustice. For this purpose, he stressed what he called 11 observances for himself and the men and women who worked with him. Rather than what I have called constraints, they were for him positive virtues to be exercised even at great personal sacrifice. Some, such as non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, and fearlessness, are common to a great many religious and moral traditions. Others, such as celibacy and the cultivation of detachment and work with the body, are found in different religions but not in all. And a few, such as the home production of goods and the disposition to touch everyone, including India's so-called untouchables, were necessitated in his view by the particular circumstances in which he carried on his struggle. Among these observances, 3 are the positive fulfillment of the constraints I have singled out throughout these lectures: nonviolence, truthfulness, and fidelity. Gandhi saw both nonviolence and truthfulness in such a complete light that the fullest observance of each would to a large extent encompass and call forth the other. And fidelity to his vows in their own right, to his ideals and thus to himself, to his obligations toward others, this was what held all the observances together and bound him to them in turn. In addition, Gandhi rejected secrecy in his dealings with supporters as with opponents. He did not consider a secrecy as a good in its own right, unlike, for example, truthfulness or fearlessness, and in this I think he was right, since an element of secrecy and privacy is necessary and indispensable for every human life. Rather, he saw how it could create misunderstanding and distrust, how it could conceal wrongdoing and shield from criticism. Opponents, he wrote, must be open to one another's views. For this reason, he always sent his policy statements and his plans to those who might oppose him, so as to give them an opportunity to respond by joining in the search for a just solution. Secrecy in political work, moreover, would have exposed him to government spies and agents provocateurs, just as insisting on personal privacy would have invited smears and scandal. Openness was therefore, in part, the best form of self-protection for him. Out of such convictions, Gandhi shaped nonviolent resistance to injustice as a creative, utterly realistic, rather than utopian, and powerful force for individual and political transformation. Martin Luther King developed this tradition and showed how it could be used in the struggle for civil rights in this country. And today there are groups such as Amnesty International and national resistance movements on every continent testing and probing the tradition still further. Persons as dedicated to ideals of compassion and justice as Gandhi or Martin Luther King cannot help but have an effect on nearly all whom they encounter, even on those who oppose their proposals for change. The living examples of moral choice that they offer create a discrepancy, a moral conflict all its own in onlookers, between all that one can ask of oneself and ask of one's society, and the compromises and postponements of everyday life. They show that the material for moral response, should one so choose, is everywhere, and that change can begin, should one so choose, immediately. Such individuals succeed, moreover, in conveying a sense that personal change and social change are linked, that by striving for nonviolence and truthfulness and fidelity in one's own life, one can help diminish the tensions and animosities that nourish distrust and hostility in the larger community. the scope and consistency of their outlook strike even their critics. And for those who decide to try to change in such ways, the linking of practical steps in their own daily existence to larger spiritual and social goals offers a method that seems to transcend the dispiriting impracticality of so many noble ideals. Such an outlook could be of greatest benefit, I believe, to the many in and out of government who now share a sense of powerlessness and of hopelessness in the face of the present crisis. There would be no need for them to adopt all of Gandhi's observances. Many who have used the methods of nonviolent resistance have found that so long as they observe fundamental moral constraints, the dietary and other observances that Gandhi stressed are a matter of personal preference rather than moral necessity. They have also found that it continues to matter to work piecemeal at resisting violence, even though the present crisis is so vast. And they have taken seriously the Quaker and Gandhian efforts to carve out spaces, territories, in human relations where violence and deceit would not be used, territories in the family, in the community, with friends and even opponents. Once these territories have been carved out, they can be extended and become models for others. This may be what's happening now when individuals and professional groups and religious groups are searching for ways to establish and practice nonviolence. And on a larger scale, it may be what lies behind the desire for geographical regions to declare themselves free from nuclear weapons, as many are proposing for Scandinavia and parts of Europe and Latin America. In all such undertakings, the reflections by Gandhi and others in our century on the role of nonviolent personal and political change are instructive, and the example of their lives shows how they struggled to carry out their ideas in practice. Yet it is one thing to observe such lives, be touched by them, compare them, and learn from them. It is quite another to become a follower, perhaps a convert, to every aspect of their undertaking. It is easy to respond so immediately to the argument so eloquently expressed in the way of life of such a person that perception becomes blurred, reflection once again stunted, short-circuited. One can then become what Emerson called a satellite, not a system, one who borrows and imitates rather than generates and shapes a moral existence. For this reason, it is also important to consider other lives, less exemplary perhaps, less single-minded in living up to ideals, always questioning even those ideals, willing to go along with some, but not necessarily with all of them. One such individual, Michel De Morteni, left an extraordinary record of questioning and examination of himself that I want to touch on briefly. He talked also about exemplary human lives, politics, and about what he was one of the first to call the human condition. He lived as we do now at a time in which partisanship and violence were so prevalent that he thought it possible that civilization, as he knew it, might not survive. Seemingly endless religious persecution and wars in the 16th century had brought massacres between Protestants and Catholics, insecurity for all, death wherever he went. The plague decimated the population in his district as everywhere else. In the ensuing chaos, brutality, deceit, and betrayal flourished. People were willing to do anything to survive and to elbow their way ahead. Public institutions were equally corrupt. Judicial opinions were for sale, and torture was common. His essays, begun in 1572 and finished in 1592, offer us not so much an exemplary life as a model for how to explore our own existence in relation to the world. In his essays, we come to know in intimate detail one man's efforts to learn who he is and what he stands for. Much to the dismay of later writers and thinkers more desirous of decorum and order, Montaigne pursued this inquiry by spreading out his views on every aspect of life as if in a country marketplace: sexuality, death, overeating, solitude, pain from gout and other illnesses, hypocrisy, friendship, There is little that he doesn't bring in, look over from every perspective, turn inside out at times. I present myself standing and lying down, he wrote, front and rear, on the right and the left, and in all my natural postures. Few other people convey as he the actual experience of bewilderment about moral standards and the slow process of sorting out his own views. Around him, Catholics and Protestants were massacring one another, civilians and combatants alike, in the name of the same God. The Holy Inquisition tortured suspected heretics, claiming thereby to save their souls. In Spain, the persecution of Jews had brought about their expulsion some 40 years before his birth. His mother came from a wealthy Spanish Jewish family. Among his own siblings, some became Protestants, others remained Catholic. In a period where brother warred against brother in every village around them, the members of this family insisted on tolerance, in part out of sheer horror at the carnage and persecution associated with religious partisanship. This experience contributed to Montaigne's skepticism about competing absolutist systems with their claims to possessing universal truth and standards by which to evaluate all human behavior without exception. But he was equally skeptical about the voices urging him to abandon all judgment regarding moral questions. Although he was willing to allow for a great variety in human responses and for differences of views on many matters, he took a firm stand against breaches of faith and treachery of all kinds, of deceit and hypocrisy, and of every form of brutality and violence. And when it came to combining betrayal and violence and deceit, as in secret plans of sabotage, Montaigne ruled out such action as dishonorable, however tempting it might seem in an emergency. 400 years before the current French debate about the secret plot to sink the Rainbow Warrior, he expressed his rejection of that kind of undertaking. He told the story of German tribesmen who sent word to the Roman Emperor Tiberius that they would rid him of Rome's most powerful enemy, Arminius, by poison. And he quotes the emperor's reply with approval. It stated that the Roman people were accustomed to take vengeance on their enemies by open means, arms in hand, not by fraud and surreptitiously. Not all things, Montaigne added, are permissible for an honorable man, even in the service of his king, or some common cause, or of the laws themselves. Likewise, he took a stand against torture, a practice as commonplace then in many quarters as today. And even though his condemnation of torture was severely criticized by papal censors protective of the methods of the Inquisition, he refused to suppress that mention in later editions of his essays. To him, torture was wrong no matter who carried it out, whether they were labeled savages or honored as judges, noblemen, or princes of the church. He could question every dogma, every certainty without losing his bearings, precisely because he held to the common core of what he saw as the human condition, what I called earlier the two preconditions for moral response of respect for persons and full awareness of their predicament. It was from this enlarged and deepened perspective that he could explore his own way of life, his views on matters large and small, and compose, as he put it, his own moral stance, his character. To compose our character is our duty, he wrote, not to compose books, and to win not battles and provinces, but order and tranquility in our own conduct. Our great and glorious masterpiece is to live appropriately. Well, now I have come full circle in these two talks, beginning with the example of 5 partisans, wary but still ready to defend the rights of their compatriots, expanding the perspective with Simone Weil to one of valuing each and every human being, drawing on her views and those of Kant for a framework of constraints on violence, deceit, breach of faith, and indirectly on certain forms of secrecy, using a remark attributed to General Zia of Pakistan to illustrate ways of bypassing these constraints in government practice and ways of reinforcing them, considering how they are illuminated by certain exemplary lives, such as that of Gandhi, and ending with the example of Montaigne, who thought that his life was anything but exemplary, and yet one which, like all other human lives, bears what he called the entire form of man's estate. I have wanted to show that there is a new reason making it urgent for governments and individuals to take moral constraints seriously. There always were reasons, and they were always good enough. But the new one provides an additional, decisive answer to the traditional questions concerning morality. Why should we concern ourselves with morality and with human values? Why should governments and public servants do so? The new answer was only a hypothesis to Kant when he envisaged that human beings might come to destroy, or as private citizens, whether as participants in policy making or as critics, often look at the military side of these issues alone. We need rather, I have suggested, a two-pronged effort, both to focus as before on trying to resolve the military impasse and thereby reduce the threat of war, but also to see the threat in its context and work to reduce the pervasive distrust that makes it so difficult to move on the military problems alone. We won't make enough progress on them, I fear, so long as the context is neglected. And in that respect, there are opportunities for all of us to contribute to the change. For in the end, it is human beings, singly and collectively, who create the context. For this reason, I see all those who work to reduce distrust as working for peace, even if they produce no direct effect on the nuclear balance of terror. Whether it be in government offices or at the negotiating table, with children or with adults, in religious or in political groups, in private life or at work, the men and women who work to diminish the sway of violence, of deception, of breaches of good faith, and of excessive secrecy, they are all doing the work of peace. Thank you very much. Mette. Oh, dear, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Questions from the floor?
If we assume that the principal adversary, and also, in a sense, the principal constituency of Gandhi during his main political career in India was the British Empire, it seems to me that he had the advantage of having an adversary that possessed an open society and a free press and a context in which the moral aspects of British rule in India could be debated. And I wonder if you could give some examples of where you feel it would be appropriate to apply the tactics that you have praised from Gandhi's career in the context of the arms race or East-West conflict. It isn't immediately obvious before what constituency one would use those tactics. The problem is the asymmetry between the concerns that people are free to express in open societies and the concerns that I'm sure many people have in the Soviet Union, but where they are not able to express them.
Yes, I think that is an excellent question, and I touched a little bit on it in saying that we always have to try to think about the limits of nonviolent resistance. There are obviously times when it is not going to work. For instance, at a time when nuclear weapons are arriving, that's not a very good time for simple nonviolent resistance. But I would suggest that there are a great many other times where it is absolutely feasible. I would suggest, for instance, that nonviolent resistance to policies of violence, deceit, and betrayal, which are not on the whole, as I said, nuclear in any sense, can work much better. We mustn't forget that there are many sets of adversaries in the world with many different forms of publication, of information circulating in the societies. It's too easy for us to think that there are only two adversaries in the world. But I mentioned, for instance, India and Pakistan, a great many others. I would also say that organizations such as Amnesty International are showing how, by very energetic and repeated pressures, they can penetrate in places where you might have thought, and I might have thought, that it would be impossible in order to free certain people, at least, from oppression. So that I do think that there are many opportunities, but I agree with you that we must also set forth the occasions when that kind of resistance is not going to work very well. I spoke in my first lecture about the difference between an acute crisis and what precedes it. I think in an acute crisis, it may be that that kind of resistance is going to be rather ineffective. But at our period right now, I think there are innumerable times, as I said, in working conditions, in families, within communities, in political parties, within democracies, where it can work very well. And I also think one has to do what one can to open up the debate in more, in societies with greater censorship.
It's humbling to speak a question after such an elegant and comprehensive set of lectures, but let me try. I turned 38 last week. On my 15th birthday, John Kennedy announced the Cuban Missile Crisis. When I was a college student, my government was telling the world that we were destroying villages in order to save them from communism. And until the day that we lost the Vietnam War, we were winning that war. What I'm trying to perhaps nudge you to do is this. With respect to avoiding being partisan, with respect to going beyond calling for a halt, with respect for persons and concern for their predicament, can we ever stop short of declaring that our government is fomenting a big lie? And let me be precise. More warheads now endanger and threaten rather than defend. 200 warheads are deterrence or defense, and therefore the arms race can only be understood as offense. The second form in which I mean that I believe have to address the big lie is this. The image of the enemy formed by projection of the dark side as the evil empire is literally out of touch with reality and dangerous. And I think these two forms of lie, saying that the arms race is for defense and declaring an evil empire, are two explicit and direct and immediate and daily and ubiquitous forms of government deception. I think perhaps the simplest form of nonviolence is to speak truth to power, and I wonder how we can avoid declaring frankly and directly that we are victims of the big lie, that the arms race is to defend us against the evil empire, and how we can do this in a form of respect for people who don't see it that way.
Well, you know, I would say one thing. I mean, I can see the concerns that you have and the experiences that have led to them, and yet I think it's very dangerous to talk of a big lie and of a government as deceptive, in part, again, because there are so many different people. Many of them are, in fact, quite honest. Many policies have little deception involved in them. And so I think, in a way, there's a danger for us in the public of painting everything with the same brush, just as there is a danger for people in the government of looking at the public as naive and imagining that everything is a big lie. So I think we always have to be very careful When we use the word lie, we have to use it very precisely and not think that it covers everything that is being spoken, because otherwise, again, we will lose so much confidence in the government and some confidence that really we should have still, if you see what I mean. I don't think you believe there's anything we should have confidence in.
No.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may. Primarily, you talk about the possibility of reducing nuclear armaments on both sides. What do you do about the Soviet Union when they have like 10,000 people working on a project and you tell them to stop working on something like that? Where do you put those people? What about all the people who are working on these massive defensive contracts and all of a sudden you cancel them? Where do they go to work?
Yes, well, I think there are people in the audience here who can answer better than I, but even I have heard of many plans. There have been studies in the United Nations, there have been studies within industries, there have been studies in particular nations about that transition. And I understand that there are also labor groups that are pressing their particular industries to undertake that kind of study. People who want to stop working on some particular arm, for instance, and start working on something else. So I think that the transition problem is not insuperable, but certainly if you just stopped one day and imagined that everything was going to be fine the next, that would not happen. You obviously have to use the existing studies and perhaps do some others and do a lot of work in order to help relocate people, in order to help industries shift over. But that should not be an obstacle to trying to cut down on the arms race.
Another point as far as free enterprise is concerned, it seems that there are two sides all struggling for territory. Right now we're running into these textile problems with these firms that are underbidding us overseas, and we really I don't see how we can abandon them, because that would sort of leave the opportunity for maybe a more repressive government moving in. So I was sort of wondering about these import tariffs and things like that.
Now you're getting me at harder.
It almost seems like we're turning into an armored camp over here, and we're having all the lower labor grades moving.
What I would say in response, and this won't answer your question exactly, but what I would say is that mine here has been a minimalist approach, what I call, this is the absolutely rock bottom that we have to do. Of course, there are many, many other large problems, those of population, for instance, those of poverty, disease in the world, and they in fact also influence the danger of war, and we have to cope with them too. But what I was talking about here was particularly what we could do with respect to violence, deceit, and betrayal. But I quite agree with you that there are many, many other policies that we have to work at, including those of trade.
Your theme has been the relevance of the ethical dimension to the nuclear situation. There is one other way which was touched already implicitly in some of the question, in which the ethical dimension is relevant. If you ask our government representatives, the present administration and previous ones, why are we in a Cold War? One of the answers probably would be in the ethical dimension, because they are totalitarian societies which the end sanctifies the means, and if we don't resist them, we will be losing our freedom and become totalitarian society, which the individual is not seen as the end in himself, as you, quoting Kant, presented as part of our tradition, which we are proud of. Now, part of that perception is also, and probably quite correctly so, a perception of societies as which majority of people, if given free election possibilities, would not vote for their governments. And probably if present administration was asked, they would say 90 or 95% of Soviet Union citizens would vote against the government. Now, assuming that, we come to an interesting situation, because we are prepared to destroy those 95% of people who don't even agree with the government, as well as the rest of the human race, as well as life on earth, in name of morality. So here we have the Kantian Ethics, which one of the formulation of the categorical imperative, people shouldn't be used as means by only ends of themselves, or in the biblical formulation of God's dialogue with Abraham, destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, so God took on himself never to destroy the innocent together with guilty, and we have situation of hubris, of the overbearing pride, which in Greek tragedy always leads to tragedy, which is going to, namely that we taking on ourselves the right to destroy the innocent, men, women, and children in that societies, in nuclear winter and all other societies, and therefore we declaring ourselves, as they are, ready to commit destruction of the human race and indeed of all life on earth. Therefore, both superpowers, by their intention, back to Kant again, are morally bankrupt. Now, I know from your answer to the previous question you don't like those general statements, but let's face it, we are facing two superpowers that are morally bankrupt, and maybe one of the ways of dealing with the situation is inviting to this forum representatives of both superpowers, singular and together, or role play for them and face them situation. You're speaking in names of your respective moralities, and yet you are willing to commit the final solution of total destruction of the human race and all the other living things. And therefore you have no right and no legitimacy because you're morally bankrupt. Could you address yourself?
Yes. Well, you know, I guess what I would say if I were one of those two representatives is, what do you expect us to do now? I mean, they might agree. Oh, okay, declare bankruptcy. But that is the question, because I guess I would think that most sensible people on both sides, East and West, at this point, would wish to be outside somehow, just as that quotation of Simone Weil. They'd wish to be outside this terrible situation that we are now in. But the question is how to get outside, and that is where this distrust comes in. And that's why I would say again that this would be one way to working at that. I don't think it's possible at the place where people now are in this situation. It should never have started, that's true. But where it is now, it's not possible just to declare bankruptcy or to go away from it or anything else, unfortunately. So one has to somehow try to lessen the danger, lower it, and try constantly to think of those future generations that we are endangering. But so that the question of moral bankruptcy is one, you know, that theoretically I can see how Kant could also agree with that. And go from there, yes. I agree. I mean, and if that would be one way to make people take moral considerations seriously, you know, I'd be all for it.
Cecil, I think we'll officially thank you now and say that further conversation can go on at the reception upstairs in the penthouse, to which you're all invited. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Cecil.